In this video, we're going to look at two extra examples about how to solve equations by squaring both sides. So before I go ahead and solve these two, I want you to pause the video and try to solve both these equations, and don't forget to check for extra solutions. Okay, so for the first problem, I have secant of x plus 1 equals tangent of x. And the first thing that I check to see is if anything's squared, and it's not, so I know I'm going to need to square both sides. So I go ahead and I do that. And I get secant squared of x plus 2 secant of x plus 1 is equal to tangent squared of x. And the next step is to recall this trig identity that tangent squared of x plus 1 is equal to secant squared of x. So if I subtract 1 from both sides, I get tangent squared of x is equal to secant squared minus 1. And the reason I'm going to go ahead and get rid of tangent squared is because my secant of x term is not squared. So I want to make everything with just secants. So I replace tangent squared with secant squared minus 1. And now I'm going to combine my like terms to get everything on one side. So I'm going to add 1 to both sides and subtract secant squared from both sides. And in this problem, my secant squareds are going to cancel. So I get 2 secant of x plus 2 is equal to 0. And then I'm going to subtract 2 from both sides. So I get 2 secant of x is negative 2. Divide both sides by 2, and I get secant of x is negative 1. And if you want to go ahead and turn this into cosine, you get cosine of x is equal to 1 over negative 1. So cosine of x is equal to negative 1, and cosine of x equals negative 1 at pi. Now, because we squared both sides, we do have to check our solution. So we're going to use our equation secant of x plus 1 is equal to tangent of x. And we're going to plug our solution of pi into our x value. So we get secant of pi plus 1 is equal to tangent of pi. And secant of pi is negative 1 plus 1. And tangent of pi is 0. So you get 0 is equal to 0. So our solution checks out, and x is equal to pi. Okay, so for this problem, we have sine of x minus cosine of x is equal to 1. Now, before I even start squaring both sides, I'm going to go ahead and add cosine of x to both sides. So I get sine of x is equal to 1 plus cosine of x. Now, you could have done this problem with leaving everything where it was, but having one trig function on each side just makes the math a little bit easier. So then I square both sides, and I get sine squared of x is equal to 1 plus 2 cosine of x plus cosine squared. And now from here, I see that I have cosine of x without the squared, so I'm going to go ahead and want to change this sine squared of x. So we know that sine squared is equal to 1 minus cosine squared. And then we write down the rest of our equation. And now we're going to go ahead and get everything onto one side. So I'm going to subtract 1 from both sides. And I'm going to add cosine squared to both sides. And I get 0 is equal to 2 cosine of x plus 2 cosine squared. So the next step is going to be to factor out the 2 and a cosine. So I'm left with 1 plus cosine. And then you're going to set both those equal to 0. So you get 2 cosine of x is equal to 0. And 1 plus cosine of x is equal to 0. Divide both sides by 2. And then subtract 1 from both sides. So cosine is equal to 0 at pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2. And cosine is equal to negative 1 at pi. So our very last step is to check our solutions. And we're going to use the equation sine of x minus cosine of x is equal to 1. So our first value we're going to check is pi over 2. So you get sine of pi over 2 minus cosine of pi over 2 is equal to 1. Sine of pi over 2 is 1. Cosine of pi over 2 is 0. So 1 is equal to 1. So that checks out. Now we need to check 3 pi over 2. So you get sine of 3 pi over 2 minus cosine of 3 pi over 2 is equal to 1. Sine of 3 pi over 2 is negative 1. Cosine of 3 pi over 2 is 0. So negative 1 is equal to 1 is not true. So that's not one of our solutions. And the last value we have to check is pi. So we get sine of pi minus cosine of pi is equal to 1. Sine of pi is 0 minus cosine of pi is negative 1. So negative and negative make a positive, so that checks out. So our final answers are x equals pi over 2 and x equals pi.